August 8, 1944. A wood on a low rise east of the road from Caen to Falaise, near the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil in Normandy. It is early afternoon, and the corn on the open ground in front is high and still. Hidden in the trees at the southern edge sits a Sherman tank with a gun that looks wrong for it, too long, reaching out well past the front of the hull. Inside, the gunner is 21 years old. His name is Joe Ekins. He works in a shoe factory in Northamptonshire, and until this afternoon he has never fired a shot in anger. Through his sight, more than half a mile away, a line of German tanks has come out of cover and turned north across the open fields. They are Tigers. There are 7 of them, and the man leading them is the most decorated Panzer commander in the German army, a soldier whose name has been in newspapers across the Reich. In a few minutes, the young gunner from the shoe factory is going to kill him. This is the tank that let him do it, and the reason it had to exist at all. The problem the British were trying to solve had a name, and the name was the Tiger. When the Western Allies came ashore in June 1944, the standard Allied tank was the American M4 Sherman. It was reliable, it came in enormous numbers, and it was easy to keep running, which mattered more in a campaign than any single figure on a specification sheet. Its weakness was the gun. The Sherman's short 75mm gun was a fine weapon against infantry, soft targets, and the lighter tanks of the early war. Against the armor the Germans were now fielding, it was close to useless at any range a crew would actually choose to fight at. The Tiger carried 100mm of steel on its hull front and its turret. The Panther's glassy plate was thinner but steeply sloped, which came to the same thing. A Sherman firing at the front of either one could watch its shells break up or bounce away, while the German gunner looking back down the same line had no such trouble. The 88mm gun on the Tiger could kill a Sherman at well over a mile. The crews doing that arithmetic from the receiving end worked out very quickly that the machine keeping them alive was not going to be the one they had been handed. The British had seen this coming, and they had a gun waiting for it. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder was a 76.2mm anti-tank gun, the most powerful the British built during the war. Firing standard armor-piercing capped shot, it threw a round out of the barrel at around 2,900 feet per second and drove it through 163mm of armor at 500 meters and 150 at 1,000. There was a tungsten cord discarding sabot round that did far more than that on paper, past 250mm at close range, though the early sabot flew wild at distance and the honest work was done with the capped shot. Whichever round it fired, the 17-pounder could do the one thing no other British or American tank gun could manage. It could go through the front of a Tiger or a Panther at the ranges battles were actually fought at. The difficulty was fitting it into anything. The gun was long, its recoil was violent, and the Sherman's turret had been built around a much smaller weapon. A design team under a gunnery officer named George Wytheridge worked the problem and solved it by main force. They turned the gun on its side, rotating the breech 90 degrees so the loader could work it from the left in a turret with no room to do it the normal way. They cut the recoil cylinders down and set them alongside the barrel. They pulled the radio out of the turret, where there was no longer space for it, and welded an armored box onto the turret rear to hold it, which gave the tank an unmistakable silhouette from behind. They deleted the machine gunner who sat in the front of the hull and used his seat and his ammunition racks for 17-pounder rounds, which were long, heavy, and awkward to handle. The crew dropped from 5 men to 4. What came out was cramped, slow to load in the tight space, and every time the gun fired it threw up a wall of dust and a muzzle blast fierce enough to blind the gunner for the next shot. The British called it the Firefly, and it was the most dangerous tank they put into Normandy. None of that conversion touched the parts that kept a Sherman crew alive, which is to say it did nothing to make the tank any safer. The Firefly carried the same armor as any other Sherman, a little under 90mm at its thickest on the mantlet and far less across the hull. It weighed about 35 tons, ran on a petrol engine of around 425 horsepower, and managed a little over 20 miles an hour. Could kill a tiger. A tiger could kill it just as easily, and a good deal more comfortably. What the Firefly bought the British was never protection. It was reach. There were never enough of them. Conversion started in the winter of 1943, and by the end of May 1944 something like 342 Fireflies had reached the Army's gathering for the invasion. That was not many across an entire Army group, so the British spread them thin, one Firefly to a troop of 4 tanks. 3 ordinary Shermans with the short gun, and sitting among them one long-barreled machine that could actually kill what the troop ran into. The Germans understood the arrangement almost at once. A Firefly's barrel stood nearly 2 feet longer than a normal Sherman's, and it drew the eye. German gunners were told to find the long gun and kill it first, before it could do to them what it was built to do. British crews painted the front half of the barrel in pale colors and countershading, faking the length of a short gun, and hoped the man on the other side was in a hurry. By August 1944, the commander about to drive into that troop's field of fire was already a legend, and he had built his name against these same Shermans. Michael Wittmann was 30 years old, a Waffen-SS officer credited with something like 138 tanks destroyed on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. 2 months earlier, on the 13th of June, he had taken a single Tiger into the town of Villers-Bocage and torn a column of the British 7th Armored Division apart, wrecking around 14 tanks and 15 other vehicles in roughly a quarter of an hour. The German propaganda machine had made him famous for it. He had been decorated, promoted, and paraded through the newsreels, and by August he was leading Tigers of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion in the fighting south of Caen. What brought him out onto that open ground was an offensive called Operation Totalize. The 1st Canadian Army, under Lieutenant General Guy Simons, was trying to break south down the road to Falaise and help close the trap on the German armies in Normandy. Simons opened it on the night of the 7th of August with something new. A night attack led by armored columns rolling forward in the dark behind a bomber strike and a moving barrage. The first phase worked. Then, through the morning of the 8th, the advance stalled, partly by plan and partly to wait on a second wave of bombers, and the pause handed the Germans a few hours to react. The man who reacted was Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division. He put together a counterattack to retake the high ground around the village of Synthos and called on Wittmann's Tigers to lead it. Wittmann took 7 Tigers north up the Caen to Falaise Road, out of cover and across open cornfields, straight into the gap between the Canadian and British columns. He was driving into a box. Off to his left, in the chateau at Cramesnil, Canadian tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers had knocked firing slits through the stone walls. Off to his right, in the wood on the low rise near Saint-Aignan, sat the Fireflies of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, looking straight down the flank of his advance from about 800 meters. One of those guns belonged to Sergeant Gordon's tank, and the gunner laying it was Joe Ekins. The Tigers came on broadside to guns they never saw. The order to fire came a little before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Ekins, in his first action, put his opening rounds into the Tiger at the rear of the group and then began working forward along the line. Over about 12 minutes he knocked out 3 Tigers, their turret numbers recorded afterward as 312, 007, and 314. The tank numbered 007 was Wittmann's. A 17-pounder round went into it from the flank and set off the ammunition inside, and the blast was violent enough to tear the turret clean off the hull and drop it in the dirt beside the wreck. Wittmann was killed, along with his entire crew: the driver Heinrich Reimers, the gunner Karl Wagner, the loader Gunther Weber, and the radio operator Rudolf Herschel. Wittmann was 30. The oldest of the other 4 was 20. Who fired the round that killed him has been argued over ever since. 3 claims have stood at one time or another. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry's Fireflies on the eastern flank. The Canadian Sherbrooke Fusiliers firing from the chateau to the west. and a rocket-firing RAF Typhoon that some accounts placed over the battlefield that afternoon. The physical evidence points away from the aircraft. A turret thrown clear by an ammunition explosion inside the hull is the mark of a shell going in through the side, not a rocket coming down from above. The detailed post-war reconstructions of the action, working from where the tank stood and the direction of the killing hits, put the fatal fire as 17-pounder rounds coming in from the flank, and most of them credit Ekins and the Yeomanry. Certainty about which single gun, out of several firing at the same targets in the same few minutes, is not something the record can honestly hand over. What is beyond dispute is that the most famous tank commander in the German army was killed in the open by a converted Sherman shooting from cover, and that the man on the gun had never been in a battle before that day. Wittmann and his crew went into an unmarked grave beside the road, and for nearly 40 years no one knew exactly where. In 1983, the German War Graves Commission found the bodies during roadworks, identified them, and reburied all 5 together at the cemetery at Caen in Normandy. Joe Ekins knocked out a 4th tank later that day, a Panzer IV, and then went back to being an ordinary soldier. He did not learn for years whose tank the 007 had been. He went home to the shoe factory after the war, worked there for 34 years, and rose to manager. For most of his life he made little of the day, and when he was asked about it he pointed out, correctly, that he had been aiming at a tank and not at a man, and that on that afternoon there had been a great many people doing the shooting. The Firefly stayed in the line to the end of the war. It remained the only Western Allied tank that could be relied on to kill the heaviest German armor at ordinary battle range until the very last months, when the Americans finally fielded a 90mm gun of their own. It was always a stopgap, an old tank with a gun forced into a turret that was never meant to hold it, and it was never as good as a machine designed around the weapon from the start would have been. It did not need to be. It needed to be available in the summer of 1944, and it was in ones and twos scattered through the troops, waiting for something heavy to come out into the open. The fight near Saint-Aignan is remembered now mostly for the one man it killed, and that is a distortion the tank itself would not have recognized. 7 Tigers drove onto that ground, and few of them drove off it. The high ground was never retaken. The counterattack failed. The machine that broke it was no marvel of engineering. It was a compromise, a reliable American hull carrying a British gun too big for it, crewed by men who for the most part had been civilians a year or two before. There is a photograph taken after the Battle of a Tiger sitting on the Falaise road with its turret lying upside down in the grass beside it. It is a very large tank, and it has been very thoroughly killed. Somewhere off at the edge of the frame is a wood where a shoe factory worker sat behind a gun he had fired for the first time that day, and did the thing the whole awkward design had been built to do.